going. Woohoo! I was about to go, and we're live, but we're not. It'll be old. Anyways, cool. Well, thank y'all so much for joining for this little chat tonight. I think just in light of everything that has been going on in our country, I mean, since its founding, but especially like in the past handful of weeks, regarding systemic racism, I just figured that would be a really good topic for us to talk about, to ask the question of how does systemic racism intersect with housing and intersect with houselessness, because it definitely does. And I have known like some of these things for a while, but just never knew like exactly what laws contributed it or exactly how it played out. So I just did some research, and y'all may already know all of these things. You may have known more than I did, but these are things that I've recently just like learned more about and was like, oh, this actually makes a lot of sense, as to why our city looks like the way that it does with regards to its homeless population currently. So just figured I'd share some of those things that I found with y'all. And then Mark is going to, so I'll show you some videos. We're going to chat a little bit. I'll give you just some information, and then we can discuss it, ask questions. If anyone else has anything that you know to contribute, like please feel free to. I'm by no means an expert in any of these things. And then Mark is going to share some kind of insight and just stories that he has experienced whilst working with Dry Bones with regards to systemic racism and how some of our friends have been treated. So the first thing I'm going to do is to share this video. So I have heard of redlining before. I'm sure you've all heard of redlining also, and you may have known everything that was in that video already. But I was just struck by how intentional everything was. I think I just grew up with, I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, in a predominantly like white part of the community, and just was kind of told, wasn't told very much, and think I just kind of assumed like, oh, things have just kind of happened the way that they've happened, you know. But to take a step back and realize like, no, these are like federal government policies that have influenced, that have created things to be the way that they are. It's not just like things have just kind of evolved this way just by happenstance. So I was just really struck by that video. And after I watched it, I looked up Denver's redlining map. So I'll also send you the link to that. I'll write that down so I don't forget. There's this whole online resource where you can click on like almost any city in America that had a redline map and like look at the map. So I'll show you what Denver's looks like real quick. It's kind of fuzzy when you sorry, because I'm recording, it's making me like do something with Chrome. I don't know what it's making me do. Okay, great. Now it's working. Well, it's not working because I have to go change something in my settings, but I'll send you the link to it real quick. And you can just pull it up on your own. Let's see. Okay, so I'm sending it in the chat. So if you go to that link, you can pull up Denver's redlining map. So when you look at it, it's just not surprising at all. The parts of town that have historically been like more populated with people of color are the ones that are red. So if you look at like the 5 Points area, like Lodo, like that whole area, they're all red. And then if you look down towards like Baker, in that neighborhood, there's a lot of red down there. And so I just think like, it's just very telling that these parts of town are currently the ones that are being gentrified, because when like white families moved out to the suburbs, the government literally like gave subsidies to developers who are developing these suburbs gave them money to develop them and said, like, but you can only sell these houses to white families. And they had a manual, and it literally said it in the manual and in like all the house deeds. And even the house deeds said things like, you can only sell this to white families, and you can only resell it to white families. So it just stayed in the hands of white families. And so as those new suburbs are being built, like new businesses come in, and all of a sudden you have this kind of economic growth. And because the people own the houses, they're building equity, which is apparently, I didn't really know this, but like the biggest way to accrue wealth is through home ownership. And so all these white families are accruing all this wealth, all this equity, and then they can sell that house and buy a bigger house and so on and so forth. Whereas a lot of people in the redline neighborhoods can't get a home mortgage because they've been put in this like red area on this map. So banks literally won't give them a loan. And so they're just renting and renting and renting, and they're not building, even if they start out in a relatively same financial place, they're not building that equity. They're not gaining that same like wealth as all of these white families. But then in the, like the video said, when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, it was like, oh, now we can move out into these suburbs or out into these other nicer neighborhoods and buy a house. But they hadn't, it was too expensive by that point. Those homes had increased in property value, and these poor like people of color who had been just renting and renting weren't accruing that wealth, and so then they couldn't afford to go there. And so it's like things just stayed the same and just get further entrenched and further entrenched. I found some statistics. I honestly don't. Oh, this was I'll send you this link as well. It was a NPR interview with, I don't have his name on here. It's with an author who wrote a book about like the history of redlining and kind of the legacy that's left in America. And so I listened to his interview, and he talked about how like black incomes are on average about 60% of that of white incomes. But black wealth is on average only about 5% of white wealth. And that disparity is because of this home ownership and this like equity and like wealth accrual. So I think it's easy for us to look out and be like, oh, well, people have similar paying jobs. People have similar incomes. They could still have like way, 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 way less wealth just because of like the home ownership issue. And so if you think about Denver, all those places like 5 Points, for example, like that neighborhood, historically people of color, now it's kind of like it had been a little bit more seen as like more run down, cheaper, more affordable properties. And now you have all these people moving into Denver because it's an attractive place to be, buying up that property, constructing big luxury apartments or like flipping houses, things like that. And so now it's becoming too expensive for the people who have historically lived there. And so now they're like, well, we don't know where to go because we can't afford other parts of town either. And that has significantly contributed to homelessness in Denver. I'm going to show you one more video. And then Mark, did you have something to say?
I was just going to mention a book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein.
Yes.
It's you can get it on your Kindle or Audible. I got it on Audible and listened to it probably a year or so ago. And it's just infuriatingly maddening to come to the realization that we've really very systematically ensured where the wealth stays in our country. And as Haley's saying, it really is very closely tied to home and property ownership. Most of us probably have parents and potentially grandparents who owned homes and property, and that wealth it stays with that family. So you inherit property, you inherit your parents' wealth, and then you're able to leverage that to better your own life. And I definitely can see in the past several generations in my family how that's worked to my advantage. And yeah, when you see the ways in which we have assured that virtually only white individuals in our country have had access, whether they had the money, or the security to access those loans, they were unable to get them. And in some ways that were spelled out very clearly regarding race.
And thanks, Mark. And as the video said, like, it was perfectly legal, like in all these government, like the FHA, like handbook and all this stuff, which is just wild to me, but also not surprising. But
if you look at, I've been reading several different books. One is White Fragility.
Oh, cool.
And one is called Stamped, or Stamped from the Beginning.
Who wrote that one?
Kendi.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Ibram Kendi.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
But the idea that if you look at who is in control, I mean, from the beginning of our country, it's been white men. And, you know, just for an example, when women were looking to get the right to vote, it had to be white men who agreed to let the women have the vote, because they didn't have any power. They weren't in a situation where they could do that. And so historically, the people in power have all been white men. So, you know, anyway, that's just my 2 cents in there.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I think that's huge, because when you think about like housing and houselessness, like those like white men did so that women could vote, they had to in a sense like give up a bit of their power, or like their control, exclusive control and power. And that's honestly like the only way that I could see. I don't know how it would happen or what it would look like, but the only way that I could see like they're actually being like housing for all people is if somehow those of us in society who have that like property power collectively agree to like give some of that up, whether it's like through being taxed more or like whatever it is. I don't know. I have no idea what we should do, but I think, focusing on like that power of like who has power and what is it going to take for that to be more equitably shared is huge. Yeah. Thank you for raising that. And I'll send y'all that link, because the book that Mark said, that's the one I was talking about with the NPR interview with the author. So I'm going to show y'all this next super quick video. Let's see. Find it. And this one's a Denver news clip. And it's just talking about the impacts of gentrification on the like rising rates of homelessness in our city. I know so many people, I mean, I think just millennials in general, like with like student loans and all of this stuff, like we're just honestly in a terrible place financially, like as a generation. And the people I know who've been able to afford homes, some of them admittedly like have worked for a few years, saved up, and just don't live in expensive places. But friends I know who live in this area, like if they own a home, it's because they inherited something. It's because someone passed away and gave them money. And that's, I mean, Jordan and I have talked about that, where I'm like, if we're able to buy a home in the next 10, 15 years, it's probably because someone in my family gave us money. So yeah, I think you can like definitely still see how the generational thing is just gonna, even for a generation that's like struggling to kind of reach certain financial benchmarks that the generations before us reached, like we're still benefiting in a sense from this like generational wealth. Yeah. So, and I think we talk about this on our turf tour. I don't know if you remember your turf tour, however long ago that was, but we talk about this process of gentrification and these changing neighborhoods. And because people often say, well, it's becoming a cleaner, safer, like more aesthetically pleasing place. And like to an extent that could be true, but it's also like, who is it becoming better for? It's mostly becoming better for like young, wealthy people who are moving in from out of state. Like that's honestly mostly who it's benefiting, or just other wealthy people who live here. So yeah, I think it's important when we think about the development in our city to think about like, who is this benefiting and who is this for? Because then that that turns into asking, like, who is Denver for? Like, who is this, like, literal city for? Like, does it exist for everyone? Maybe, maybe not. It seems like it's growing more and more to exist for only a certain, like, pocket of the population, unfortunately. But we will see what happens. Trying to see if there's anything else in these notes that I wanted to share with y'all. One other just kind of interesting tidbit that I found, and this was also in that interview with the author Rothstein that Mark mentioned earlier. He talked about the New Deal. So in the 1930s, like after the Great Depression, when FDR passed the New Deal with all the like public housing and jobs and things like that, the Public Works Administration began to build the first public housing for civilians in the country. And it was primarily for white, middle class, lower middle class families, and then like people of color. And it was explicitly segregated. So you'd have public housing for white families and then public housing for everyone else. And it initially wasn't necessarily like for people who were considered poor. They just needed more housing because there wasn't a lot of housing being built during the Great Depression, obviously. So they just needed more housing. So you have it wasn't subsidized like it is today. Like they didn't have vouchers. It was like you're just renting an apartment. They just needed more space. So, but as these like suburbs started being built and as these home loans started giving out, the white families started to leave the public housing to go purchase these homes. And so then eventually the people of color like took over the white public housing. So now public housing is like mostly for people of color. And then it eventually later on became subsidized and like essentially for poor people, for people who are experiencing poverty. And so I just found that interesting too, because our idea of public housing today is, you know, not the cleanest, not the nicest places to live, subsidized, free or reduced rent, like all of those things. I think we have certain images, especially regarding race, around the idea of public housing. And it just wasn't always that way, which was interesting to me. So, yeah. Anything else anyone wants to add about any of these things? I know that was a lot.
I wonder if you guys have the answer for more recent history, because I saw something and my brain is so stuffed with fluff, I can't remember where it was. but I know it was a video, and they were interviewing this woman in Atlanta who's probably around my age, or maybe 10 years younger, has several children. She's a single mom making $9 an hour. So we'll leave minimum wage out of this at the moment, but and it was like that, you know, getting more and more expensive, and she could not find housing. And they said and this is what I wanted to ask you if you know more about it. A big part of the problem was back in the 80s, late 80s, whoever was in charge in Reagan administration of housing and urban development, maybe, actually said the government is getting out of the housing business.
Oh,
and so, and after that, less and less supply, higher and higher prices. So I was wondering if you have more information on that. That's the basic.
Yes, I do. Let me, hold on. There's a whole document that Denver Homeless Out Loud has kind of compiled about like the history of homelessness in the United States. And there's a big chunk about just that. So I'll send that to you because it's way more detailed. But yeah, they slashed the HUD budget. It went from $77 billion to, I want to say $7 billion or maybe $13 billion, something like very drastic. And the government essentially was like, we're getting out of the business of housing. Like, we're going to leave this up to the private market. This is not going to be our responsibility anymore. But in reality, they didn't really get out of housing. They got out of a certain kind of housing for certain kinds of people, because they would still subsidize loans and things for construction of like luxury apartments and things like that, and like private construction. So yeah, that contributed a lot to like the increase in the homeless population numbers in the country, like exponentially. I think I'll just send you the document, but there were like very few after the New Deal because of all the public housing. And then by like 2010, it basically went from like 10,000 something to like millions in those 20 years in between. when the budget was cut. So
Sorry, what went from 10,000 to millions? The homeless population?
the homeless population.
You mean it used to be nationwide, only like 10,000 people?
I can't remember. I'll send. That's what I'm saying. I'll send you the document because I feel like I'm butchering the numbers.
Yeah, because that's like Denver.
I want to say it was like 100,000 people.
Wow.
Before the New Deal, and then, if I'm remembering this correctly, before the New Deal stuff, like all the public housing, then they got everyone housed, and because the government was like, all right, housing is going to be our responsibility. But then when they slashed the budget and said, no, we're getting out of housing, then it just exponentially grew, and it was like by a few million within like a couple decades.
That was also the same era that they defunded mental health and shut down all of the mental health facilities that actually housed people and cared for them, which were arguably not necessarily great places, but maybe better than the street.
Mm-hmm.
I think just the conversation about rent in Denver, I was thinking about how I would have lived under a bridge with my friends, just as the kids we serve do, had my circumstance been what they're experiencing now. So I looked recently at, I have lived in apartments all over Capitol Hill in the mid 90s. And I found a lease recently where we paid for a 2-bedroom apartment on Capitol Hill, right not far from the office on 13th and Ogden, $325 a month. And it's renting now for $1,500 a month. And we lived in there with, I had 3 roommates that we split the $300. I suspect we probably all had minimum wage jobs that weren't necessarily stable. I remember like losing jobs and finding jobs and being out of work in that time, but you could manage to get by like that. And so minimum wage at the time was right around $5. And now minimum wage is just a little better than $10. But the rent on that apartment has increased 5 times. So it's discouraging, I think, to think about just the housing reality in Denver right now, especially as we encounter people who really would like to work toward a different way of life. It just seems like the reality is, even if they can manage to get in a place where they can work full time, I don't know where the places are that they could spend that money to live indoors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Rough.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Denver Homeless Out Loud website right now, and they have this page that talks about, it's like the 7 myths of homelessness is what they call it. And they've done a lot of research, and there's one, like this one myth they talk about is they're lazy and they should just get a job. And underneath it says 60% of homeless people are working or have income through disability or SSI. A full-time minimum wage earning Colorado worker makes $1,316.80 per month before taxes. The average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in Denver is $1,400. So like even people who are working, so the 60% of homeless people who have some form of income just like can't afford a place to live. So I think it just raises a bunch of questions for us as residents. I mean, we don't necessarily all live in the city, or any of us in the city or county of Denver, but as being in the metro area, like we have a responsibility to think about how can we push for change, whether it's like rent control, or whatever it is. There are a lot of people who have a lot better ideas than I do. But I think it's important for us to start thinking of these questions systemically and start thinking of these like so-called issues systemically, and figuring out like what our part is, like what power do we have to make change, and what power do we have that we might need to give up. I don't know the answer to those questions, but and then Mark, what you said about mental health made me think about the current conversation about defunding the police. I don't know if y'all have heard about this, but it's gained a lot of traction recently, defund the police slogan. And I personally think am very much in support, because they're not saying completely get rid of police. They're just saying reallocate the millions and millions of dollars we spend on policing to something else. And I can't remember, I've seen statistics being thrown around, but one of the most common statistics I've seen is that apparently like 911 calls, or calls that like police respond to, only about 4% of those are considered like violent or high risk calls that would warrant like carrying a weapon, or might warrant carrying a weapon, maybe not, but you know what I'm saying. And so like so many of our friends, a lot of them don't suffer from mental illness or drug addiction, but some of them do. And the ones that do are often confronted by police when they're in a state of distress. And so it's like, okay, is there money that we can shift from policing to, like what Mark is saying, like mental health? So instead of sending a police officer with a gun, can we send a mental health worker to help connect them with resources to support them in that moment, instead of giving them a ticket or taking them to jail or arresting them? Because that's costing us taxpayers money, is all of the ticketing and the unnecessary like jailing that our friends experience on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. Stacey, did you have something to say?
I was just thinking, I have seen some of that, and we're piling so much on top of police. I was a teacher, and teachers are being piled on top of to be parents and nurses and doctors and mental health people, and all of this, and we're piling stuff on people that we shouldn't be piling stuff on.
Mm-hmm.
We need to take some of that off, and like you say, really prioritize what do we want the police to look like?
Right.
Are they here to serve and protect?
Yeah.
And what does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's a good talking point. I think it's important that we do sit down and look at that and say,
Mm-hmm.
I can't exactly remember the wording, but it was something like, if you carry a gun, that's going to be aggressive and violent to begin with.
Yes.
And so if that's your sort of what you're taking into a situation, then the situation is going to become violent.
Right.
It automatically escalates.
Yeah. And like for our friends who are living on the streets, the cops are the ones who are coming and telling them they have to move. The cops are the ones who are giving them tickets. Like that's the relationship they have. So of course they don't like them at all.
Right.
I've heard of like a few instances, like one of our friends was like, "Oh, you'll never believe what happened." Like I can't remember. They were like in a park, I think past curfew, and this cop came up to them and they were super worried. And he was like, "He slipped us a $20 bill," like crazy things happening like that. And it's awesome, and they love it so much, and it makes me happy. But it's like, if they're escalated for whatever reason and a cop shows up, just based on the relationship they already have, like that is just not going to help in most cases. It's been super interesting for me to witness too, like what that looks like in the dry buns community. Because I have witnessed only like 2 fights since I've been involved with the dry buns community. And every time it's fizzled out because like Robbie or Mark or Matt or Nikki or someone that they're like closely are related to and who knows them is getting close and is getting in the mix. Like that's what is diffusing them, is someone who's standing there and being like, "Hey, it's going to be okay. Like I'm here. We care about you. Let's cool down, take a step away and figure this out." And you can even go on, it's called, I don't know how I found it, but I found it today, and it's denver.abalancingact.com. And you can type in like your income and how old you are, and it calculates like approximately how much you would have paid the city in taxes, like if you work in Denver. And it says what they would have spent it on. And so I did that today. And the very first category is affordable housing, and it's $2.75. But then if you go all the way down, the highest is, unsurprisingly, public safety. And it's $106.88.
Sorry, this is out of how much money? Like
out of like 200 something. What was the approximate? Like $272.
Okay.
Yeah. So $2 for affordable housing and 100 and something for public safety, which I just found very fascinating. So it's just definitely clear that our money is being funneled into certain things. So I just wanted to bring that up as a topic because I think the phrase defund the police is like can be a bit very charged, can get really charged reactions from people because I mean, everything in our world is being politicized right now, but I just think it offered really good points because it's just saying like, hey, there, like Stacey was saying, there might be a better way to do this. Like, how can we rethink these things? Yeah. So that's kind of all I have. Do you think people have any other thoughts, questions? And then Mark, you can share.
I was thinking a lot of it, and I have no answers here. Goes back, back more to the individual level and family breakdown and things like that. Because when you were talking about you all saying only if someone dies can you get a home. When Rob and I were first married, we lived in LA for 5 years, and we escaped because we knew we could never afford a home there, and he had a good job. And it was exactly then in LA, the only people, the young marrieds we knew at our church who owned homes, either their parents had died and they had an inheritance, or their parents paid the down payment on a home just so they could get in. And I thought, well, okay, that's where Denver is now. But even so, that requires, or even just making rent, not even home ownership, requires having parents who help out or a good relationship. And like many of you know, from very broken families with generations of substance abuse or just dangerous people. And I know I don't have a good point except we all need each other, and when we fail each other at that individual heart level, that's what multiplies out. And yeah, it's just depressing.
Yeah, it really is. And it's hard to like confront these things because none of us asked to be born into this. Like none of us, I mean, I think that's what is so difficult about these conversations, I think, for us as white people, but it's why it's so important. It's because, I didn't make that law in the 1930s, but like I was born into this situation and have benefited from that, and need to recognize that, which I think is the first step, is just recognizing like, oh yeah, my family has definitely benefited from that. And even for like poor white families to say like, you have still had access to certain things that like people of color have not historically had access to. So yeah, I think it's important for us to think about and admit and own up to the ways that we have benefited, whether we wanted to or not. Yeah. Oh, Mark left. He'll be back. So I appreciate y'all engaging in this conversation. One last thing I want to show you before Mark chats or anyone else says anything, which you are more than welcome to. I just wanted to show you this graph. So the point in time survey, we talk about it a lot. It's the survey where they go and they try to count the number of people who are experiencing homelessness in Denver.
And do they do that just once a year or?
Okay. Yeah, they do it once a year, and they do it in January usually. So they enlist all these volunteers to go out to shelters and just on the streets and different agencies like us to like count people and get them to fill out these surveys. And this one particular, let me pull it up. This one particular, oh, I don't know why it's doing that. Let's see. Oh, window. Here we go. Oh gosh, it won't let me do it. Man, because I'm recording, it like won't let me share my screen, which is weird. And I don't know how to get it off. Hold on. I'll send you all the graphic later, but I can just tell you the statistics. So in thinking about all this stuff with housing and redlining, and gentrification, like it definitely contributes and impacts like who ends up on the streets versus who does not. So if you look at the general population in Denver, 65.2% of the population is white. 53.8% of the homeless population is white. And then only 5.1 of the total population in Denver, 5.1% of the total population in Denver is Black. 21.2% of the homeless population in Denver is Black. So people are often like, oh, but there's more white people on the streets. And that's true, but it's very disproportionate. You have 5% people who identify as Black in the population, and then 21.2% of the homeless population are Black. That is a stark disparity. And then you also have 22.4% of the general population is Hispanic or Latinx. 22% of the population are homeless. So that's pretty, that is pretty even. But then only 0.5% of the Denver population considers themselves Native American or Alaska Native. 0.5% of the whole population, and 6% of the homeless population is Native American or Alaska Native. So there's just these grave disparities with regards to race and homelessness in Denver. And I'll send you all that picture later. So we're definitely seeing effects of these generations and years and decades of policies and just the ramifications that they continue to have in our city today. Yeah. Mark, would you like to share now, whatever it is that you have to share?
I suppose I might have some stories that I've experienced in which I just realized that as much as we, especially, it seems like in Denver, we often want to believe that race isn't a huge issue here. And I sometimes wonder if part of that is because we've worked things out in Denver to where people of color are living outside of the areas that we just frequent. So it seems as if race isn't an issue. It's like, oh, well, it's mostly white people here. Race isn't an issue. And it's obviously that's not the truth. And Denver's had a long history with, the Ku Klux Klan, for instance. And I was around in the 90s for the Martin Luther King Day riots that happened consecutive years when the ACLU fought for the Klan to have the right to organize rallies on the Capitol steps. And so I definitely just have a memory of the ways in which race has really been a difficult subject in Denver, and there's just not the equality that we'd like to assure ourselves that there is. And I spend a fair amount of time in court with our friends. One of the things that falls under the umbrella of street outreach is just hanging out in courtrooms with people and accompanying them, making sure that they have rides if they desire, or someone just to be present in situations that are uncomfortable and scary and the future is uncertain. And typically I do the best I can to make myself available. And there are maybe two young men who immediately come to mind. They're maybe 3 or 4 years apart in age. One of them is a young white man and one is a young Black man. And I've sat in court with each of them more than a dozen times. And often I'm sort of reticent to share these stories because they don't necessarily paint our friends in the best light. But the reality is, our friends, they have struggles in their lives just like we all do, but they don't have walls and doors to hide behind, which is, I think, one of the advantages that many of us have that that keep us from being too deeply involved within the legal system, maybe. The young white gentleman that is a dear friend found himself facing some felony assault charges, felony assault and menacing with a deadly weapon. And actually, he maintains that he was innocent of this crime, and I think he actually was. I think it was one of his buddies who was dressed similarly, who actually um, hit a man with a padlock that was on the end of a chain. Um, but this young man wound up in court on this and took a plea deal that I think everyone who was involved warned him against. Uh, and it, I think, involved a deferred sentence in which, if he could manage to stay out of trouble for the next 2 years, everything would go away. But if he were to find himself in some more legal trouble, he was going to be sentenced to 4 years in a state correctional facility, penitentiary. And I was concerned about this because it's just nearly impossible to be on the street and not have police contact on a regular basis. And while this trial was going on, before this deferred uh, sentencing finally came about, he was in the Denver County Jail probably for like 60 days. And eventually he takes this deal. He's released. I was there. I understood for him everything that he needed to do to follow through and take the next steps toward ensuring that he not find himself in a bad space and potentially prison. And I he I knew when he was going to be released from jail. He called me from the library as soon as he got out. Hey, could you bring me a sleeping bag um, and some food or something along those lines? And by the time I was able to connect with him at the library, he ran into a pal who wanted to celebrate his release. They had a high time. I think drank a, just a copious amount of whiskey. And so, in the hour that it took me to get the sleeping bag and the food, he had already drank himself into the hospital, blood alcohol poisoning, and was actually probably lucky to survive that incident. Um, so, immediately, within an hour or two of getting out of jail, has already had an incident in which the police were called. He was taken by an ambulance to a hospital, was actually hospitalized for multiple days because of the damage he had done to himself in this good time drinking party at the bus stop on Broadway. Is released from the hospital, does not ever make contact whatsoever with his probation officer. 3 months pass, 2 or 3 months, and he's back in just not a terribly healthy relationship that escalates in not great ways pretty often. He and his girlfriend were in a fist fight with one another. in public under a bridge that in the middle of the day, noontime, traffic everywhere. Obviously, a young man and woman are physically beating each other openly in public. The police show up. They're both arrested. And I hear about this pretty quickly, and it was really just distraught over this because I don't want this young man to spend time in prison for something that actually started. Like, does he make poor decisions on a daily basis? Yes. um, but serving prison time for something that his friend did, I mean, I think that it's fair to say that he needs a lot of help in a lot of different ways, and probably doing some county jail time on occasion actually provides him with the extended amount of sobriety that allows him to just like take a look at his life and question the decisions he's making, and hope to get back on track or find a track at all. But I was really worried about him spending time in prison. I started visiting him. He was taken back to Denver County Jail, and was kind of just confused why. Like, I very clearly heard the judge explain that if he were in any sort of trouble, he would land in prison. He immediately essentially gets arrested, goes to the hospital, never checks in with the probation officer. All sorts of witnesses see him having a fist fight with a young lady, taken back into police custody, sits in jail in Denver County for 30 days. And I visited him pretty regularly in jail when he was there that time. Um, and and was concerned the whole time about, like, when's this prison thing going to kick in? At the end of 30 days in Denver County Jail, he calls me. He's been released, and he's very excited. No probation anymore. They just killed his number, which is what the kids on the street say about, like, they're off paper. There's no more probation. They don't have any responsibility to the courts or the legal system other than potentially some unpaid fees. So I heard a judge tell him that he would go to prison. He made a number of terrible decisions, went back to jail for 30 days, was released, and is completely off paper. No probation, no nothing. Time served, you're done, you're off the hook. We're done dealing with you. We don't want to deal with you, right?
Do you think,
Well,
Mark, sorry to interrupt you real quick. Do you think it was because just with so many people in the system? Well, I know race is going to play into this, but is it like his crimes were so low level that, do you think that was it? Just forget it?
I don't know necessarily exactly how to answer those questions. I don't know, but what I do know is it's not helpful in treating someone or encouraging someone to get the treatment they need to live a healthy and productive life, and potentially contribute to our society and community as a whole, to constantly threaten people with things that you're not going to follow through on. Like, the lesson he learned in that was there's not really consequences. Like, I'm been terribly inconvenienced. I hate the cops. I don't like to be in jail. But he was sternly admonished by a judge who very clearly explained that he was going to do prison time if he slipped up. And what actually happened was he was completely off the hook. Young black friend of ours, along probably there's some overlap in these stories, and in just the timing and the way they played out. likes to not necessarily pay every time he hops on the light rail. He's on the light rail, approached by the light rail Wackenhut security. They ask to see his fare. I don't have the fare. And somehow in the midst of this, security determines that they have felt threatened by this young man. And he gets off of the train. I suspect that he probably cussed them out and angered them with the way that he interacted when they confronted him with their authority. I'm certain that he didn't respond well to that and was rude and probably aggressive. Whether or not he might have actually verbally assaulted them or threatened them with bodily harm, I'm not. I don't know. Maybe, but maybe not. But gets off of the train at the next stop. They've radioed for police because of the interaction they had. Police show up. He sits down, probably still not being a cordial young man. And he is arrested for felony menacing with a deadly weapon, which was a spiked bracelet that he was wearing. That's the weapon, a fashion accessory. And I've probably been on this. What started with this charge, I've probably sat in court with him 25 times. He's been in and out of jail on this, and probably spent a quarter of the last year in county jail. And similar story, except for rather than deferred sentencing, I think that what he eventually pled to resulted in a deferred judgment. And I don't quite understand the nuance between deferred sentencing and deferred judgment, other than maybe a deferred judgment is slightly more advantageous because maybe it's less likely to be on your record in the end. I don't know for sure. And again, I was just like, I didn't feel good about him taking that plea, really, because I whatever happened with the bracelet on his arm, I can't imagine was felony menacing with a deadly weapon. But he's young. He's a person of color in a city that's predominantly white. I sat on phone calls with himself and his father, and listened to just like generational trauma inform him in the decision he was made. His father telling him, just take whatever plea deal it is, even if they in the plea that they offered him. Actually, we convinced him not to take the plea. The plea they offered him actually was to plead to a felony, a lesser felony, but it would still have been a felony. And I thankfully,
still impact his ability
that
to get
didn't
housing.
work out, because I was like, don't just walk into a felony, force them to convict you of this crime, because you don't want a felony on your record if you don't have one already. That's senseless. So actually, I recall that however it worked out in the end, and he was strung along by the court in a way that was infuriating for me, because I could tell that they knew how traumatic each of those court appearances were for him. He was afraid every time that he was not going to leave in anything but handcuffs, was going to be back in jail. And the way that they spoke with him and interacted with him was, I think, pointedly, they desired to instill fear in him and wanted to leverage that fear so that they could have a plea deal and didn't have to worry about whether or not they actually had a case they could win. And multiple times it was, this is the last chance at the plea. We would go through all of this like drama and trauma of like, do I have the nerve to continue to plead not guilty to something I know I didn't do? This is the last chance. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, I would show up with him again, and there would be the same bad deal available. And again, it's the last chance. He had probably 3 or 4 last chances, and it was just really difficult to each time that he was forced again to say, no, I didn't do this, I want to take this to trial, it was more difficult for him to do so. And along the way, there were more conversations with his dad. His dad, I recall, telling him, hey, I had to take a felony. I had to plead to a felony that I didn't commit when I was your age, just so that I could get my time done and be out to support you. And it, just painful, the whole thing. And of course, he's a young man who has anger issues and has not been able to meet the requirements of that deferred judgment, I don't think, and has had an incident that now he's got a case in Denver County, which actually was also considered a domestic violence incident. However, rather than having a punch out on the street with a young lady, they had an argument that resulted in him breaking her phone. And the police responded in the midst of that argument. He broke her phone, which was considered an act of violence. So that's a domestic violence charge. Because he was frustrated that she wouldn't leave his apartment when he asked her to. Did not put his hands on her. She did not tell the police that he had put his hands on her, but they had been in an argument and he damaged her property, and that's a domestic violence charge. And so now that triggered in this other county, hey, this young man has not been in compliance with the things that he agreed to. And that's still an ongoing battle. But it just pains me to see that it doesn't feel as if that system is serving either of those young men well. One of them is continuing to fight for his survival in a system that will profit from him being imprisoned. I mean, that's why we're not going to defund the police, because we make a whole lot of money by privatizing our prison industrial complex. Somebody gets paid to keep people locked up. And as long as that's the case, as long as we're profiting on imprisoning people, we're going to continue to fund a system that ensures that investment continues to pay off.
Mark, are there private prisons in the state of Colorado? There are. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's just frustrating, and it's been eye-opening just to see along the same sort of timeline the really sort of disparity in these two young men's experience with the court and with the legal system and navigating relationship with the police. So those were some of the things as far as like sort of stories that are specific to race and inequality that we've experienced in our friends' lives. I'm sure that there's tons of stories in ways that this plays out. It's interesting that we have these seasons in which we focus on things like housing, or we focus on things like race. We focus on, how are the police and who are here to protect and serve us, how do they interact with different segments of our society? But like all of these things are so intrinsically connected to one another that it's until we can start to like recognize the ways in which they all are connected and feed upon one another, I suspect that we'll continue to just struggle more than maybe we ought to. It's about all I got, I suppose.
Thanks for sharing, Mark. I appreciate that. And I think it's important to acknowledge it's not just like, oh, here are these two stories that seem to differ based on race, therefore we've proved it. But it's like, I mean, I think it highlights trends that are definitely real. And then it also just calls into question like the way that we treat and view things like the police and things like law. Because I think I think when I say that, I mean mostly like decently well off, like white Americans tend to think like, oh, like the justice system, it is justice. Like you do something, you get like what you deserve based on that, and things like work out the way they're supposed to, like that kind of thinking. But as you can see kind of from the stories Mark told, there's a lot of subjectivity that is involved, and there's a lot of humanness that is involved. And a lot of that subjectivity is enmeshed with intentional systems that have been created to push certain people down and keep certain people in their place.
I would add that I think I met the public defenders that served each of these young men, and I really got the impression that they were invested in working well for them. So there's aspects of it. There's like those little bright spots where I'm like, hey, I think that there's people who are working in this system who desire for these young men to have equity to some degree, but I'm not sure that we have a system that is designed to allow for that to be the case necessarily.
Yeah, like a few like really well-intentioned, or even a good number of well-intentioned individuals isn't necessarily enough to like upend the system as it functions. That makes sense. And people like Lauren, who's on this call, Lauren the lawyer, we know she cares about those things as well. Yep. Well, we're about at time, and I want to respect you all's evenings and time. You're welcome to hang on and chat more if you want to. I'm willing to hang on for another like 10, 15 minutes if anyone wants to chat about anything. But I just wanted to say thank you for joining. I hope that this conversation can be one that is ongoing, and one that like prompts us to really consider our place in the world and our place in the Denver community, and really prompts us to action. I just appreciate your willingness to think about the ways that like all of us here gathered as white individuals, have benefited from systems that were put in place a long time ago and are still working as they were intended to work. Appreciate your willingness to engage with that. And just want y'all to know that we, like me, Mark and I, obviously, like we don't know everything. I think we all honestly probably collectively know as much as one another. But we're here to be conversation partners with you all in any of this if you ever would like to. Well, I don't know about Mark, but I'm willing to chat about any of this if you ever want to. So know that I am here. Yeah, and just encourage us all to be paying attention as these things continue to be in the public light, continue to pay attention and educate ourselves as to what's going on, to what has happened in the past, to how the past has influenced the present, to see what we can collectively do to try to upend some of these unfair systems. So thank you all for engaging with this, and hopefully this will not be the last of these such conversations. So, and hopefully conversation is not where it will end, but good place to start. So yeah. So yeah, feel free to leave if you need to leave, but we can continue to chat for a minute if you would like.
So thank you to you both.
Yeah, this was just so really good. So thank you guys both for
of course
your time and your information.
Yeah.
It was great.
Our pleasure. I'm glad it was helpful. And I'll send you all those links and pictures that didn't work in an email sometime tomorrow, probably.
Okay. Sounds good.
Cool. Well, does anyone have anything else to add? Cindy or Lauren? I think y'all are still muted. If you want to say anything, you're welcome to say something, but you don't have to. Can they unmute themselves?
I think so.
I think you can. Well, I guess all is well. Cool. All right, Mark, anything else you have to say?
No, thanks for hanging out and chatting with us. It's nice to see you guys.
Yeah, it's good to see you all.
It's no fun just being locked down and away from one another.
That's hard.
Yeah,
I know.
It is not ideal. Not ideal.
Cool. I'm
Cool.
thinking with all this stuff, you know, I want to do something. I want to put it down to practical individual level. It's like, this is way bigger than me. I mean, of course, it's the way we treat people in our lives, but that's not going to affect the housing situation. And and I'm not a billionaire. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard because it's like, on one hand, you can only do what you can do. But on the other hand, like, we can't settle for, like, oh, we can't do anything about it. Like, oh, well. I think that's the one thing I find that's encouraging about the fact that these systems were intentionally created, as like distressing as it is to acknowledge. It's like, oh, well, that's kind of good, because then that means that we can intentionally recreate them to be different.
I heard that usually the city council has 30 minutes for the public to speak. And the other night, it went on for hours and hours and hours and hours, and they did not stop the public from speaking, and they didn't cut them off at 3 minutes, which is the typical time. And they sat there and listened to anybody and everybody who wanted to speak. I just thought that was fabulous. You know, I mean, let's do that. And then instead of shooing everybody out and voting behind closed doors, they were actually communicating. They were talking, and they would listen to maybe input from the public. And I think we need to have more of that, you know.
I'm hopeful that maybe one day we can get to that space without there being a fear that the city is going to burn. I'm fairly convinced that that's probably what has led to them being more receptive to what people have to say. It's been frustrating and disappointing, just in the midst of these times, to sort of recognize that we've moved to a place where a peaceful demonstration isn't paid any mind. It's like, well, that's nice. They're upset about something. But suddenly, when there's going to be a monetary sacrifice, like, oh, we have their attention now. And I hope that we can move to a place where that's not necessary.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
But it unfortunately might be at this moment.
Well, you know, hopefully if places like city council will allow that to happen more often, where they listen to the public and they're more transparent
yeah.
in their dealings, then that might mitigate some of that.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit, you know.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, and I just encourage all of us to think about, because it is, like Lynette, you're completely correct. It's overwhelming because it's also big, like kind of like the whole idea of it being intentionally created is overwhelming and distressing. The fact that it's also interrelated is also overwhelming and distressing, but it's also comforting at the same time, because if you address like one thing, it's gonna ripple out and affect these other things that are like interrelated, because you can't necessarily like just it, like when you're supposedly addressing just one thing, you're addressing a lot of things. That's what I'm trying to say. But yeah, I encourage us just to think about like what communities are you in, and like what can be done there and what can be done. So Lynette, whether it's at your church, like what needs to happen at your church? Like, do conversations need to be had, or do certain things need to change? Does the church need to start carrying them, like going into the community differently, or advocating for certain people, or whatever it is? Yeah. And Stacy, you having been an educator, like, I don't know if you're still connected to the school system, but like, you know, or your church as well.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all things that we can do.
Yep.
But yeah. Well, thank you all. It was so good to see you. I look forward to being able to see you in person whenever that happens. And
I'm giving virtual hugs. That's all I do.
yes, all the virtual hugs. All the virtual hugs. All right. Well,
Thank you guys. Nice to see you.
And we'll talk to you soon.
Yes.
Thanks,
So.
guys.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.